1918, from the end of the First World War, or the Great War, up until 1929, and effectively ended with the Wall Street crash and the ensuing Great Depression. War and Revolution. In 1918, there were shortages. The war hadn't ended yet. There were power cut shortages, largely because of the war itself, obviously, and the Allied blockade. Because the German government hadn't effectively financed the war campaign, there was rampant inflation, and there were anti-war demonstrations throughout the country. The earlier period of unity and large popular support for the war back in 1914 had largely dissolved. You can see some of the signs there. Nie wieder Krieg, no more war. Furthermore, to exacerbate the suffering, there was a worldwide pandemic of influenza, which actually ended up killing more people globally than World War I did. So this compounded the difficulties within Germany as well. So, as well as these shortages, power cuts, you've got the influenza epidemic. The military leaders, Ludendorff, who was effectively the brains behind the German military leadership, he makes this statement: Germany is in grave danger of military defeat. A peace must be made before we lose on the battlefield. This shows that Ludendorff and the German military leadership do realise that there is no prospect of military victory, that defeat is inevitable. Overtures then are made on the behalf of the military leadership and the Kaiser to the American President Wilson. After all, he's recently come out with his 14 points statement, and this seems to offer a measure of hope for Germany for a possibly fair settlement to the war. So overtures are made to Wilson about possibly ending the war, about an armistice, and this is Wilson's response: there can be an armistice as long as Germany becomes more democratic. The Reichstag, more power; the Kaiser, less. Well, Kaiser Wilhelm wasn't overly keen at this stage on abdicating from his position of real political authority and power. As events unfolded, though, it quickly became apparent that the government, the military government and the Kaiser, had lost control of Germany. In October, there was the Kiel Mutiny. Sailors mutinied against their officers and refused to carry out orders. The government had lost control. There was chaos. In November, there were further mutinies at Rostock, Cuxhaven and Lübeck. The military was losing control, especially of the navy. And in Saxony and Bavaria, socialist republics were declared, which effectively split away from the central government. There's a picture of Kurt Eisner, who became the leader of the Republic of Bavaria for as long as it was there. So new democratic Germany started to take shape. On the 10th of November, after receiving advice from his generals that the war was unwinnable and that he himself was personally unpopular, the Kaiser fled to Holland. And Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the largest party in the German Reichstag, the SDP, the Social Democrats, he became the temporary leader of an interim government. Well, soon, democratic elections were held. A new constitution was created, and we'll have a look in more detail at the features of the Weimar Constitution, which actually made it one of the most democratic countries in the world. In the elections of 1919, however, there was no clear winner. No party had more than 50%, a majority. The SDP, Ebert's party, the Social Democrats, did win the most seats and did manage to form a government coalition. Because Berlin was in chaos with running street battles, demonstrations and so on, the new government actually met in Weimar, and this German town of Weimar lends its name to this whole period of German history. From 1918 to 1923, the Weimar government, Germany went through a period of crisis. In some ways, it's quite surprising that the fragile government actually manages to survive this period. So it shows perhaps it's not as weak as you might think. It had to cope with a lot of problems, though. After the Treaty of Versailles came out, and especially in 1921, when the amount of reparations were announced, also Article 231, the whole Dolchstoss myth made the government very unpopular, certainly in the eyes of conservative and right-wing people. The government itself was blamed for stabbing the German army in the back. This myth, of course, ignoring the reality of German military defeat. Inflation had been rampant throughout the end of the war and continued to be, as Germany was lacking in raw materials and natural resources, and money was being exported in the form of reparation payments. This caused a lot of inflation in Germany and particularly affected people like the middle class. In 1919, there was actually a left-wing attempt to overthrow the government. Now, the government was a moderate left-wing government, but the Spartacists were communists. So the Spartacist revolt of 1919 attempted to overthrow the government and create a Soviet Germany along the lines of Soviet Russia. So the government managed to survive the Spartacist revolt. We'll look in more detail at that later on. In 1920, there was the Kapp Putsch. You have to look at this gentleman. He looks very severe, doesn't he? He does look like the sort of humorless authoritarian figure you might be involved in something like the Kapp Putsch. This was a right-wing attempt to overthrow the government and bring back the Kaiser and traditional authoritarian Germany and to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. Furthermore, in 1923, the Germans didn't pay reparations. The French and Belgians consequently invaded the Ruhr. There was the Ruhr crisis, which led to even further inflation, hyperinflation, ridiculous prices, a huge level of inflation. A loaf of bread could cost millions of marks and even more the next day. And this was an opportunity, the Ruhr crisis, for a young politician, Hitler, to attempt an overthrow of Germany in 1923. That was the Munich Putsch. So despite these three attempts to overthrow the government, the Spartacists in 19, the Kapp Putsch in 20, and Hitler's attempt in 1923, the government does survive this period of crisis. And in 1924, the Weimar Republic enters a period of recovery, 1924 to 1929. The Dawes Plan is negotiated shortly towards after the end, or effectively it is the end of the Ruhr crisis, the crisis of 1923. In this, American banker called Charles Dawes negotiates American loans of £40 million. These loans that Germany can then use to help pay its reparations and to revive its economy. There's a new currency stabilizes, which ends hyperinflation. The new Rentenmark is introduced. The new government spends money on housing and public works, which is obviously good for a lot of people. And as a consequence of the economic recovery as well, unemployment began to fall. So these were kind of the golden years of the Weimar Republic, and reparations were again cut under the Young Plan in 1929. And during this period, from 1924 to 1929, during these relative good times, support for extremists such as the KPD, the Communist Party, and the Nazi Party, support for these was low, certainly in the elections. They did not receive a lot of electoral support. This man, Gustav Stresemann, was a central figure throughout all the governments of the Weimar period. He was the German foreign minister for a while. He was key in negotiating the 1925 Locarno Treaty, which in 1926 led to the acceptance of Germany into the League of Nations. He was a signatory on behalf of Germany of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which renounced war as an instrument of foreign policy. And in 1929, Stresemann helped negotiate the early withdrawal of British and French troops from their occupation of the Rhineland. So it does seem that things are going really well for the Weimar Republic. It survived its period of crisis. What could possibly go wrong? Let's have a look then. So it was a limited revolution. Although there were mutinies in the naval shipyards, which makes you think actually of Russia, it didn't lead to a Soviet-style state. It led to a democracy within Germany, a new democratic Germany. From 1918 to 1923 was the period of crisis, at least 3 attempts to overthrow the government. There were more actually, but there was the 3 that we will cover in a bit of detail. And of course the Ruhr crisis. In 1924 to 1929, a period of recovery. Although, as we'll see later on, this period of recovery is financed by American loans, which does lead to a certain vulnerability in Germany, which you will see later on. So I hope you've managed to make some notes there, and good luck with the quiz.